Welcome to what might be the most bizarre Breaking the News Plus thus far. And you know who my guest is going to be, Lou Raguse. Because he has a tale that only Lou Raguse could have that aired on KARE 11 last night about the ruby slippers, kind of, sort of.
And so this is the theft of the ruby slippers from back in 2005 at the Judy Garland Museum up in Grand Rapids, Minnesota.
Thought that case was solved.
Yeah, so it's pretty much over, but the thing that was missing was the element of the story of the mastermind. So at last we heard, prior to the slippers being auctioned off and selling for $32.5 million, that was the last big story.
Yeah.
Prior to that, this guy named Jerry Soliterman was all set to plead guilty for his role in it. It wasn't even clear through the public documents at that time that he was the mastermind, although reading between the lines, you could kind of figure that out.
The mastermind of the theft from 2005.
Yes. Not only the theft, but the plan to sell them back to try to get money, kind of the extortion attempt that took place years later. So there's the theft, there's the attempt to get money for the slippers, and eventually
insurance money.
Eventually the charges being filed.
So who's Jerry Soliterman?
Jerry Soliterman, that is the guy who is the mastermind. He passed away in March of this year after he had agreed to plead guilty. The date was on the calendar. We were all going to go, and then they canceled it the night before because he was in the hospital. Mm-hmm. And then within a couple weeks after that, he actually passed away.
Okay. And when you say he's the mastermind of this, that's interesting to folks because this case got huge attention because they're taken from this very earnest mom and pop Judy Garland Museum in Grand Rapids. It was sad. We went up there and the people that ran the museum were heartbroken.
Yes.
It wasn't a hard heist,
right?
But they got the slippers. Big deal. So this mastermind you found through your sources, this wasn't his first rodeo.
Yeah, and so even doing preliminary research on all newspaper articles, his name is throughout the Star Tribune through the 80s for his what they would call a fencing ring, which is essentially a theft ring where they steal from stores, and this person that they call a fence resells it on the black market. And that's where Jerry Soliterman, that's where he made all of his money.
Where does he live? Like a big fancy house?
Well, no, a pretty modest rambler in Crystal, Minnesota is where he's spent the last 10, 15 years before he died. As a fence, the person that sells stolen merchandise, you need to have connections because you need to find somebody who will purchase it. Well, Jerry Soliterman had contacts within the mafia and his mafia ties, and this is all according to police and in prior investigations. The mob ties go all the way back to his father, Emil Soliterman, who ran a gambling house right after Prohibition in Minneapolis. And there was mob shootings that took place inside of it was a cigar shop. It was basically he was licensed to have a cigar shop, and the mob guys would gamble in there. That's what it was known as back in the 1930s.
All right, so like father, like son, we've got mob connections out of a humble home in Crystal. And so 2005, Jerry goes up and takes him by himself, or I remember another man.
Right. So my story comes from the first information that we got from Jerry's eventual confession, relayed to me by investigator T.J. Tourville at the Crystal Police Department.
Okay.
So he says when Jerry finally told the story of what happened, this is how it went down. In 2005, he was watching the news, and there was an innocent news blip that said, hey, you can head up to the Judy Garland Museum in Grand Rapids and see the real ruby slippers that Judy Garland wore as Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz movie. They had, a few different pairs constructed for the movie. This is one of the authentic ones that was worn in the movie. And the news article also mentioned that they were insured for $1 million. And Jerry Soliterman, watching TV, he could tell that it was an easy mark in his words. And also, he thought that those were real rubies. If you look at a picture of the slippers, you can tell there are jewels up near the top by the bow on the shoes, and they're red. And he assumed that they were real rubies because he heard it was insured for $1 million.
Sure. And
so he called his friend Terry Martin, who's a longtime crime associate. They met when they were in like a teen prison, like a juvenile detention.
Okay.
After getting in trouble as youths and spent their lives of crime together. They were always associated through many different crimes that they were caught for. Terry was actually acquitted of a major one along the line. But he was living up in the Grand Rapids area. So Jerry called him and convinced him, hey, let's go get it. We get these shoes. We'll pop off the rubies and I'll sell them in easy mark. That was the plan. And so he went up there with Terry. They drove in Terry's van over to the museum. Terry busted the glass door in the back to get through and just basically busted the case that the slippers were in and ran out with them. And so back in the car, Jerry stuffs them down his pants.
The ruby slippers. He stuffs them down his pants.
Yes. The ruby slippers that just sold
Thank
for
you for that detail.
$32.5 million.
They have been in a man's pants.
Well, it's an important detail because as they squeal out of town, they make a lot of noise, literally squealing out of town, and a state trooper pulls them over minutes after the heist.
Oh.
The slippers are still in his pants, and the trooper comes to the window and is suspicious. What are you guys up to? And, these guys have talked to police before, so they know what to say, and they basically tell him to take a hike. And the the trooper asks for permission to search the vehicle, and they say no. And so he lets them go without even a ticket.
What?
He didn't know that the museum had just been burglarized. But if he did, he could have solved the crime the night that it happened.
Right there on a traffic stop.
Yep.
Okay, so they get away.
They get away, but Jerry at that point, first time he looked at them, he knew they were not real rubies. So according to the Crystal Police Department, what he decided then was, well, what we got to do is wait out the statute of limitations, because for theft, burglary, I don't know exactly what it was in 2005, but let's say 10 years from now, I can't be prosecuted for a theft anymore. Whatever the statute of limitations was.
Okay.
And at that point, this is something that art thieves do, and Jerry was a longtime art thief. They try to sell it back to the insurance company. Because
how do you sell it back to the insurance company?
I think it was advertised as a reward in this case.
Gotcha.
But an insurance company, let's say that the shoes are insured for $1 million. Well, if the shoe company or if the insurance company can get the shoes back, let's say that they pay $200,000 to get them back, then they either don't have to pay that $1 million, or they can sell them back and recoup some of their loss that they had to pay out on the policy.
This is a lot of work to be a criminal,
I
guess.
Sounds like it.
Okay, so I covered this not from what you've got, but just the surface level stuff.
Yeah.
Then eventually there's an arrest of Terry. I've never heard of Jerry.
Right. Well, actually, before that, so 2005 is when the theft happens. Fast forward to 2018, before the pandemic, the FBI announces that we've got the slippers back. And they didn't give any details. But they had a press conference. They said, here's the slippers. We did a sting operation. We have them back. Nobody's charged right now. The investigation continues. And so what we know now through my reporting and through the story is that at that time, that's when Jerry started his plan to get these slippers sold.
Okay.
That whole time, that up into the 13 years that had passed, he had the slippers hidden in the soffit of his garage and then buried in his garden.
His tomato garden.
Yes, in Crystal, Minnesota, where the next door neighbors knew absolutely nothing.
Why did he? I don't even want to know why he buried him in his tomato garden. So we get to 2018.
My theory, though, is that he had so much stolen stuff in his house that there was always a possibility that his house gets searched.
It gets raided. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And he wanted to make sure that if it did, that the slippers would not get found, because that was kind of his crown jewel that he had on hand, is by far his most expensive thing that he had that he could sell for money.
Okay. And so 2018 happens, and what leads the feds to getting those slippers back?
Well, they had received a name, which is Joe Friedberg, who is perhaps the most famous defense attorney in Twin Cities history. They had received a tip regarding him, and it didn't really go. That was years earlier, didn't really go anywhere. And then in 2018, Joe Friedberg called the Grand Rapids Police Department and said that he was inquiring about the reward, and said that he had a client, or he had information that could get the slippers returned. And so then the the Grand Rapids Police reaches out to the FBI, and then according to Jerry, Friedberg then wanted more money than what was being offered. It was a $200,000 reward. Friedberg was able to negotiate it up to $400,000. Jerry says without their permission or without them signing off on it. And they were worried that caused more scrutiny to come over their deal, because Jerry just wanted to deal with the insurance company and obviously didn't want law enforcement involved.
Why is Joe Friedberg one of the most prolific defense attorneys who since passed even involved in this?
Well, his entire career, he's represented some pretty bad people. So that's not unusual. Going way back to the famous heist of the Norman Rockwell paintings in the Twin Cities, he very similarly came forward to say, hey, somebody reached out to me to see if I can facilitate a return for money of these. And the Bar Association or Minnesota Lawyers Professional Conduct Board told him, no, that's not ethical. You shouldn't do that. So he had already been in this space before.
Okay.
And then now all of a sudden he's doing it again.
But he was told previously he couldn't do it?
Decade earlier or more, yeah.
Okay, that's going down a whole other conversation that we could have. But let's get back to the slippers. We'll
to make a long story short with that, Joe Friedberg showed up with the slippers expecting to receive money from the insurance company. But at that point, FBI agents had taken the insurance company's place, posing as the insurance company. He gave the slippers to the FBI agents, and then they said, hey, sit down, let's have a talk. Okay, this is 2018.
Yeah, okay.
Nobody was charged at that point. FBI just got the slippers back. The investigation continued. Eventually, they figure out through sources that Terry Martin might be involved.
He's the guy that
He's
steals
the guy
them
in Grand
initially.
Rapids. So the FBI got Terry Martin to flip because his wife is in the country illegally, and they basically threatened, we're going to deport her unless you talk, and then we promise we won't deport her. They kind of leveraged that.
Okay.
So Terry admits his role, but he's still protecting Jerry. And Terry tries to pin the blame on Louis Anderson's brother.
Get out of here. Stop
The comedian Louis Anderson.
What?
His brother Kent is one of the most famous thieves in Minnesota history.
Okay.
Louis used to call him the safe cracker during his stand-up routines.
Are you making this up on
No.
the spot?
No.
All right, viewers,
but-
I have not heard any of this yet.
But he is dead already at this
Okay.
point. He had died in 2008, and it was kind of obvious that Terry was trying to blame a dead guy.
Got it.
To protect Jerry.
Right. Why is he protecting Jerry?
Well, we don't completely know.
Okay.
But at this point, Jerry's still not on the radar until they start looking into, people are telling the FBI that there's not a major crime that Terry Martin would have committed unless Jerry Slitterman was involved.
Right.
And so they start to believe it's Jerry, but they have no proof.
Mm-hmm.
And so they do a search warrant at his house looking for the slippers and don't find anything, or not for information about the slippers because they already have the slippers back. And they notice that there's obviously stolen stuff in there, but that's not within the purview of their search warrant. They don't, FBI does not do just garden variety theft stuff. So they call Crystal Police Department and say, can you guys help us with this? And that's where Crystal comes into it. And so to make a long story short with them, Crystal Police are able to investigate the theft of stuff in the house. At the same time, start talking with Jerry's wife. And Crystal Police calls her a confidential informant. I've confirmed through other public documents, public court records, that it was his wife, and we're not naming her because she ended up not being charged.
Okay.
But essentially, she was helping Jerry with his daily shoplifting and a lot of his thefts. But Crystal Police believed that it was against her will.
Okay.
And so, they were presenting it as, she's a victim. And she also talked about Jerry abusing her. And she talked about that Jerry was holding, that he claimed that he had a sex tape of her that he would release to her family and friends if she didn't do what he said and kept quiet. So he was, according to the Crystal Police, he was controlling her. But eventually she told the story to Crystal Police that that Jerry, one day she was in the garden and Jerry showed her, hey, these are the slippers. And they essentially buried the slippers in the garden together. And so all of a sudden, this is all this new information. They use that information against Jerry to eventually get him to confess. And in order to, prevent future prosecution against other family members, he agrees, we'll end this right now.
Wow. And that's where it stood until there was about to be a guilty plea.
Correct.
And he passed away.
Now, one other weird twist along the way.
Don't even.
So Crystal Police is about to do that first search warrant in the home in Crystal. And what they put on there is like very specific artwork that the FBI had told them is in there. Like, hey, like, you know, this is something that you'll be able to find because they needed to be specific on the search warrant.
Okay.
And they take the search warrant to get it signed by a judge. It filters through the processes. I'm not sure how many eyes are on it along the way. But then by the time the next morning when they get there to serve the search warrant, the specific things that were on it are missing.
So somebody tipped Jerry off.
Somebody tipped Jerry off. And even Jerry's wife told the Crystal Police Department that he was packaging up that stuff. And it was obvious that he knew exactly what he needed to get rid of.
As that...
So there was a mole somewhere.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
That's the implication. Crystal Police said, you know, they didn't make an accusation of who or anything like that, but they shared that with me as part of the story.
Are you going to find them all?
That'd be interesting. But they have, through other interviews back in the day, Jerry had on the payroll like police officers that would tip him off in more than one department. He allegedly had a judge that would look out for him. And so, you know, with having these mob connections, just like in a movie, he apparently had people in power who would help him out.
So, of what was in that house that can still be returned to its rightful owner? It couldn't have been just this, you know, obviously the slippers got turned back, but what else was in there?
Well, there was apparently $350,000 worth of stolen goods. And I saw it all in the evidence room in Crystal. It included a bunch of paintings, prints, framed prints, sculptures, a zebra fur, and then even a bunch of random stuff like a snowboard. I mean, it really runs the gamut. But apparently in the basement at his house, he had like a chain link fence gate holding stuff in a room. So it was like, okay, obviously we're not supposed to go in here.
Right.
But it made it look pretty obvious that there's a bunch of stuff behind this gate that he's trying to hide.
Wild.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for those of you who don't know, you should know if you watch Breaking the News Plus, Lou Raguse is a prolific author now, so I smell a third book coming.
It'd make a good one. There is other people. See, it's a saturated market here with the Ruby Slipper case. So there's a documentary on Hulu, which is very good. I would recommend it for people who are interested. It was made by a filmmaker here in the Twin Cities who does some good work, Maria Oz. And there's also a book coming out from a woman who's a writer in the Twin Cities who, through my, when I was getting deep into this research, I would notice that someone else has done some of the same checking on certain things, and it's her. So I'm sure her book will probably be pretty good too. But who knows? I'll have to see what's included and what might not be included and see if there's some space for that.
Well, I appreciate this deep dive into things I never knew about, per usual, Lou Raguse. Check out his story if you haven't to supplement this conversation. Then go back and watch this again, and you can have all kinds of dinner fodder conversations. Lou, thank you so much for joining us on the Plus.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, thanks for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow night. Take care.